Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force, the regularly scheduled meeting, hybrid meeting on June 13th. My name is Jack Dovenier. I'm the co-chair of this task force. Before we begin, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. And before we begin, just two items that aren't on the agenda. One is, many of you have seen a letter recently from the sheriff, and Stephen and I spoke, and I've asked the sheriff to talk about that a little bit and answer any questions. We thought we'd insert that into the agenda immediately following the annual report. So Stephen, you'll do Justice Project, I'll do annual report, and the sheriff, and then on to the budget. So, and the other thing is, we want to welcome the new chief of police from Bellingham, Chief Mertzig, and I've asked Mayor Fleetwood to introduce her to us.
Is Becky here?
I see it. I see her. Well, I don't see her, but I see her name, so I think so.
I am here. Sorry, my 8 o'clock went a little long, but I am here.
No, we know with law enforcement and so forth that we don't expect you to always be here and on time.
Thank you.
Well, first off, I apologize for not being present in video form. We're really excited here in Bellingham to, after considerable time and effort and process, gotten a new police chief for Bellingham. She was introduced at a swearing in ceremony, I guess the week before last. We had a really nice in-person swearing in the city council chambers. Lots of law enforcement from around the region was present. Council members were present, lots of staff. She comes to us from Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. She worked most recently as the contract chief of police for the city of Stanwood. She harkens from Ferndale, so she's local, and we're just really pleased to have her. It's been a really positive shot in the arm for all sorts of things, including morale and just a sense of a person in the seat, finally, in a permanent way. So thank you, Becky. Go ahead and introduce yourself further if you'd like.
I don't know if I can follow that. That was such a good job. No, I'm excited to be here in Bellingham. I've felt like I've hit the ground running. There's a lot of work to do, but I think to sum up probably best was last week Mayor asked how I was doing. I said it's crazy and I love it. So that's where we're at.
Well, I'll join Jack in welcoming you, Chief, to the task force. BPD has always been a really stalwart and active participant in so many things the task force has done, so much of the progress this community has made in preventing and reducing incarceration. So we welcome your involvement and look forward to the contributions you'll make to the group effort here.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Jack, you're muted.
I think I cut myself off, but I just want to say thank you. I appreciate that. I'm hoping to, bring at least a fresh perspective to everything. And I'm looking forward to being part of this group.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Mertzig. And, as I look at the screen, thank you for everyone. There's a lot of busy people that are making time for the work of this task force to be here and to try to improve our system. And so Chief Mertzig and everyone else, we very much, Stephen and I appreciate, as does the county, your time in being here. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Stephen for our first item on the agenda, which is the BGAT Justice Project Needs Assessment. And that would be, I guess, Barry and Stephen.
Yeah, I'll lead into Barry or maybe into Perry. Just to say that the Stakeholder Advisory Committee for the Council's Justice Project doing needs assessment and gap analysis for possible future bond initiative on the ballot for a new jail and related services has really done a bang up job in gathering data to help those assessments of where we are and where we want to get to. I think you heard at the last meeting about the criminal legal data work group that Barry pulled together, which just did a super job working with Dr. Alexis Harris from UW on some legal system data and involved, drew in and built on the strong foundation of Caleb's index committee work. Barry also put together what we've lovingly come to call the BGAT group, the Behavioral Health Gap Analysis Team, and wisely chose leadership of Perry Mowry from our health department. The BGAT group did a really super presentation for the last SAC meeting last week, June 8th. This is information that will certainly inform the Justice Project and the Stakeholder Advisory Group, but really has a longer life than that. It'll inform the work of the task force well beyond that planning process. And so we thought it was important to have that presentation to the entire task force membership. And so with that overly long introduction, Barry, I don't know if you want to take the ball here or turn it over to Perry.
I just wanted to say a couple of words, and I just wanted to reach out to our new police chief, Chief Mertzig. If you have any questions about this project, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I'd love to sit down with you and give you a briefing. Stephen did a really good job of giving kind of the 101 overview. It's, the project is designed to come up with a needs assessment based on some of these studies that we're doing right now. You're about to see one of those, the results of those studies. We thought it was done so well, the steering committee wanted to get this in front of the task force. So without any further ado, I would turn that over to Perry and his team from the BGAT, and they're going to walk us through this. Thanks, Perry.
Thanks so much, Barry. If I can, Jackie, Lassiter, or Jill, I wanted, excuse me, Dean White has not joined us, and he is part of the presentation team, so he may be an attendee, but if he could be made a panelist, that would be great. The second thing, if I can be made a presenter so that I can share my screen, that will be wonderful.
Thanks, Perry. I made you a co-host. You should have share screen ability.
Also, I'm a presenter, if I could be promoted.
Yeah, I invited you to promote to be promoted, so look for that.
Oh, it said speaker, that you were giving me the ability to speak, but not. There we go.
We're working on getting Dean on. Perry, it might take a minute.
Sorry, I'm sending Dean the link right now.
Can you see the screen, Stephen?
Yes. I think you're ready to go.
Wonderful.
Perry, you're on the agenda, though. I think you want the slide just before that.
Good morning, folks. As Stephen and Barry had shared, we wanted to provide a brief overview of the work that the Behavioral Health Gap Analysis Team, what we're referring to as the BGAT, completed over the past 3 months to update the original Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force sequential intercept model that was initiated in 2019 and then updated in 2020. This is the initial update work that was presented to the Stakeholder Advisory Committee on the 8th of June at the Justice Project meeting.
Hi, everyone. Jackie Mitchell with the Whatcom County Health Department Response Systems Division, Behavioral Health Programs, and you are looking at today's agenda for the meeting, in which Perry will talk briefly about who was on the team and how the team was chosen, and then we'll go over the goals of the presentation as well as the background of the sequential intercept model. And then we'll talk about the process for updating the SIM that the team went through, as well as program and service gaps that we uncovered while working through that process, and then the gap prioritization.
The Behavioral Health Gap Analysis Team listed here is made up of 13 subject matter experts with experience and knowledge of behavioral health programs, prevention intervention activities, housing homeless programs, shelter services, and other existing programs in the community. The BGAT includes representatives from various programs and specialties within the health department, emergency medical services, and housing and healthcare integration.
All right, my little presenter here is helping out. So my name is Mike Parker. I was honored to join this team. Just a really brief mention for those of you on the task force. This probably looks familiar because the task force has been using, as you know, sequential intercept for a long time. This update, though, and this process has been really robust and really thorough, and I think is going to be a great asset for the Incarceration Prevention Task Force. So thanks to all who are on it, and again, honored to be one of the few non-health department people on there. So today we want to obviously go through the sequential intercept, and I know we have some new task force members, so this may be the first time for some of you. For those that haven't seen it for a while, hopefully it'll be a useful review. We're going to learn how the SIM has been used in other communities and actually in our own community. I think Perry's got an example of something that actually shifted during the time of our analysis. So it really is a live process and a live framework. And today we're going to kind of continue, and we're going to ask for your feedback again, as we have in the past. And there'll be chances for task force members to make suggestions after this presentation as well. And you can reach out to steering committee members, or if you're on a subcommittee, on one of your subcommittee chairs can also take feedback from you. But we want to continue to prioritize programs and services most needed to reduce the jail census. Next slide. All right, so just a quick reminder and just a refresher that what the SIM is. So the sequential intercept model was developed in the early 2000s by the folks that you see there. It was kind of a joint, most of those people are all PhDs, and through Policy Research Associates, which is a private contracting firm. They work directly then with SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the Gaines Center to widely publish it. Essentially what the SIM is, it's a conceptual model to inform responses. It takes what are really complex life experiences of individuals before they run into issues with law enforcement, at the time of law enforcement, and it really tries to take what may be not a linear path, maybe a very circular and sometimes repeating path, but tries to stretch it out and make it into a linear model so that we can look at opportunities for intervention. And as I've mentioned, it's been used by communities around the nation to kind of analyze the flow, how people might get involved with the criminal legal system, and what might be positive interventions, and at what key times might we implement those to try to reduce that incarceration cycle. Next slide, please. This might be familiar to task force members who've been around for a long time, but in 2018 and 19, you may remember the task force used the sequential intercept model to inventory existing programs. Many of those, of course, were actual Whatcom County Health Department programs, but there were a variety of community-based programs and, of course, programs inside the jail. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, like I said, or maybe if this is new for you, but what the sequential intercept model does is it tries to take that timeline experience, right, and lay it out in a linear fashion. So intercept 0, we think of those things as prevention work. Those are things before an individual has even had any interaction with law enforcement at all. Intercept 1 is where we actually have interaction with law enforcement. Intercept 2 would be when the person is in initial detention or maybe initial hearings. Sometimes they may or may not be in custody at that time. Intercept 3 is in your jail and courts. 4 is reentry after the person is released. And 5 are those post-incarceration community supports that we hope will break the cycle and help keep people out of the jail and returning. Another key piece on the slide, though, is kind of how the things get rated. So as you'll see, and Perry and Dean will actually go into the sim a little bit and show you some of the examples. But in tier A are things that we have, right? So think of that like as an asset map for what we currently have. We separate that out into tier B for those things that we have, but we may not have enough of. And there's quite a bit of that, especially with staffing issues and workforce issues that we've seen. And this should be no surprise to members of the task force. And then the last one is C, those programs that the community has identified as being extremely important to reducing incarceration, but we don't have it all. And I think of that kind of as our wish list and what we would like to have. Next slide, please. One of the things that happened that I got really excited about in this particular update of the SIM was that, we realized some of the things that were on there weren't really programs, right? They're not evidence-based programs. They were kind of suggestions, or maybe they were ideas about how we could do communication. Not quite yet. So what we did is we wanted to capture those. And just so folks know that put in the hard work on the task force on creating the content for the SIM, nothing was removed. But some of the items that were either policy issues, and we've dealt with a lot of policy issues. We've actually had some legislators on our meetings to try to talk through some of those policy issues. And as I mentioned too, sometimes some of the things that we noticed on there were actually process improvements. And so we found a way to create an addendum. So we're going to keep those things, and it helps keep our SIM kind of pure to really looking more at programs. But policies and processes, we've captured a way to be able to capture those. And next slide.
So that's me, Mike.
Right. And sorry about my interruption. Thanks all.
Yeah. So this is a slide of tier A, which is essentially the first tier of the 3 in the sequential intercept modeling. And it consists of behavioral health programs, which intersect the criminal legal system. And these are programs which are already in place in the community. And it's important on this slide to note that Intercept 0 was developed by this task force to acknowledge the many prevention related and community programs which have their impacts on keeping people from ever ending up in the system, the criminal legal system, but which may take some time to have that impact. And in addition, there are many best practice programs or evidence-based programs or even innovative programs listed on this table, in this particular tier, which are either exist here in the community, which have great outcomes, either here in this community or in other communities, depending on the phase of development. But it seems like a subject for a much different presentation. It would take time to get that one together. And anyway, it's just too much to put into this presentation. Some of the programs currently under development, like alternative response and co-responder programs, which are very new and innovative and under development now, could not have been made possible without folks like Councilmember Dan Hamill, Under Sheriff Doug Chadwick and former police chief Flo Simon. And also there were a great many first responders and still are a great many first responders who have taken time out of the field to help us understand their work and the details of how we might put all of this together so that we can have a behavioral health response in the field. Next slide. And this slide shows some data from our jail in terms of behavioral health people. And you can see that there's quite a high incidence, probably higher than what the national data tends to say, of people with serious mental illness in the jail, as well as people with suspected substance use disorders. This confirms what we've been hearing from both staff that work in the jail as well as jail staff about the high acuity levels in the jail. We think this is due to the fact that the state has been shifting services to communities, but then not resourcing those communities enough to provide wraparound services for folks with some very severe challenges in behavioral health. The data continues to be quite high. You can see as of the month of April, there were approximately 50% of the average daily population, which was on psychoactive medications, psychotropic medications, mostly mood stabilizers and antipsychotics intended for people with serious mental illnesses. And then you can see there's still quite a wait for people waiting for competency restoration. And next slide, Perry's going to talk about the process that the team went through to update the sequential intercept model.
Yes, thanks, Jackie. Wanted to talk just a little bit now that we've talked about the SIM and the process of the SIM. The team met weekly for a 3-month period of time to review, discuss, seek input, and reach consensus on updates to the sequential intercept model and the addendum as well. We discussed the sequential intercept model design and purpose, as well as the parameters for the team that the team would use in considering updates that were placed on the SIM. We reflected on the importance of racial equity and the complex issues that exist in the jail and the community related to the programs and services we were discussing. We started our work with the original sequential intercept model, as Mike made reference. We developed, that was developed by the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force in 2019-2020. And as Mike had mentioned, we found it unnecessary to actually remove any of the programs that were originally listed. We did remain mindful that our work was an initial step in identifying the existing programs and the gaps in services for individuals at risk of already or being involved in the criminal legal system. The next step that we took was really establishing a criteria that the team could use in considering updates and additions. There were so many great programs and so many suggestions that we'll talk about here as we do the presentation, but we really oriented down to the fact that the primary target population that we were looking at and working with were youth and adults with mental and substance use disorders who were at risk of or who have already become involved with the criminal legal system. We knew that research, as Jackie had made reference, reflected that a significant number of individuals in the jail suffer from an array of untreated mental and or substance use disorders. So we oriented towards programs and services designed to prevent involvement in the criminal legal system in the future, which is obviously Tier A. Those programs are reflected in Intercept 0. We look closely at programs and services that support individuals diverting from or successfully exiting from the criminal legal system, which includes programs in Intercepts 1 through 5. I believe that everybody received in the updated packet a copy of the sequential intercept model and in its entirety. It was too difficult of a document to actually present in the slides, so felt that that would be a better reference point for folks to have a copy of that. We also focused on programs and services that support individuals who may not have behavioral health issues, but are struggling with housing, education, employment, and relationship challenges. To gather additional input, the team sent a copy of the draft SIM that we were working with and a survey requesting review suggestions from a number of groups in the community. We've listed those groups here, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list, but we wanted to begin someplace. We were thrilled with the fact that 21 different entities responded to us, provided feedback and suggestions. We reviewed that feedback and those suggestions as a team, and placed some of the items on the sequential intercept model, and some of the items actually fit better in the addendum. Then, as has been mentioned, we did a presentation to the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. We requested input and have an approach to gain further input from that group, as well as doing a presentation to the Public Health Advisory Board, and again, requesting input and information from them in that regard. And I will turn it over to Dean at this point.
Thank you, Perry. So as has been mentioned, the way the SIM can be used is to focus on a particular target population of people who could be diverted from jail bed use with additional services. And our focus here is individuals with increased risk of legal involvement, experiencing mental or substance use disorders. And then we've, of course, looked at, where there are shortages of existing services, that's tier B, to remind you, and services which are missing altogether, which again is tier C. And then the way that one can approach it is to consider where are the most pressing gaps at this time, and if they were addressed, would have the greatest impact on the jail census. Next slide, Perry. So the subject matter experts who were a part of the group, the gap analysis team, looked at each of the items in tiers B and C and then gave them a ranking of either a 1 or 2 or 3 in terms of which gaps we felt were most important to address and have the most impact in reducing jail census. Now, that's not to discount the importance of other services that are documented in the SIM and have helpful outcomes. But we felt it was important to remain focused on the primary purpose of the SIM, which is to ID those programs that will have the greatest impact on jail census. Also, as Perry has referenced, our work is not a done deal. There is still opportunity for input and more work to be done in terms of examining those things that this group set as priorities. But we're going to start with a discussion of the ones that we came up with. And if you had a chance to look at the actual updated SIM document, in tiers B and C, you will have seen next to many of the items, a number highlighted in yellow, 1, 2, or 3, which is the result of that work. The focus here is going to be those things that the group identified as having number 1 priority. And we've grouped them into 4 categories. Next slide. Those that we call community-based, those that are jail-based, those that really relate to reentry, and then services related to post-incarceration. And as you can see from the items in parentheses, those services in those various categories really often relate to more than one intercept. And so, for example, community-based programs can impact folks who are yet to have any contact, who are in intercept 0, but also those who are now beginning to have contact with law enforcement, as well as those who are in a mode of having left incarceration and trying to reintegrate back into the community. And I think there's going to be an opportunity for folks to ask questions about this in the agenda. Perry, I don't know, but let me just say we're open to questions. So the first group is the community-based group, and here are the items we identified as having the top priority. There is an increased need simply for mental health and substance use disorder assessments, and particularly timely and on demand without waiting. When a person's in crisis, and they finally understand they need help, and they approach professional service organization for help. If they can't get in immediately, then the opportunity is missed and they likely won't follow through. There's a lack of community substance use disorder treatment. Just the overall volume of services available is not sufficient to meet the need. And in particular, there's a need for an increased capacity of a program called the Program for Assertive Community Treatment, which is a more intensive program for folks who are experiencing a serious and persistent mental illness, and often in conjunction with a co-occurring substance use disorder. And there's a need, there's a problem with the response time to law enforcement when they request an evaluation for involuntary detention. If the person that they have engaged with in the community appears to qualify for an ITA investigation and possible detention, if there's not a quick response, then the potential is they will still be arrested and potentially incarcerated. And that's simply a question of the capacity of the designated crisis responders to actually be on the scene in a timely way. Next slide. With respect to jail-based services, there's an insufficient number of intensive case managers for the jail. Those are folks who participate, who support folks while incarcerated and participate in post-release service planning. There's a lack of access to timely competency restoration process. And I think I've heard reference to a number of people who've waited on average as long as 55 days for even the beginning of a process to restore competency and allow them to participate in their own defense. There is a need for increased access in the jail as well for mental health and substance use disorder assessments. Again, timely and on demand without waiting. Once a person perceives their need, getting to that need as quickly as possible is paramount. And there's a need for an evidence-based, effective treatment for methamphetamine dependency. The problem is the literature at this point, as I understand it, doesn't really indicate consensus on what amounts to good evidence-based practice. But nevertheless, that's a huge need. Now, I should mention that we learned recently in the course of our process that in the jail, a recent grant was obtained that has allowed the jail staff to begin in the medical services area to provide medication-assisted treatment and also medication for opioid use disorder. That had been given a high priority. We moved it from Tier B to Tier A because of the fact that this grant's now in place. This is an indication of how dynamic this process really is. All of these things that are jail-based require adequate space within the jail, and so that's an ongoing concern. Next slide. In terms of reentry, following incarceration, there's just insufficient staff who are engaged in doing that work of community-based reentry services for inmates, both before and after their release. And the next item really identifies a process problem as much as it does a lack of staff and resources that has to do with how quickly inmates who are released from jail can have their Medicaid eligibility reinstituted in order to then receive treatment services, both physical and mental health and substance use disorder treatment following discharge or release. Often those services have been arranged or can be arranged before they're released, but then the provider is unable to be paid for those services until the person has their Medicaid reinstated. And I recall in an earlier meeting that Wendy had mentioned that It may be an issue of the degree to which the managed care organizations give priority to that Medicaid reinstatement as much as they do to turning off Medicaid when the person's incarcerated. Next slide. And then post-incarceration. This is not news, but there is just an insufficient amount of permanent supportive housing locations for folks released from jail and then back into the community, by which we mean a facility that has 24/7 staffing and on-site clinical support. And of course, there's a challenge about how one achieves fidelity in the way in which permanent supportive housing is implemented. But there's just simply insufficient capacity for those programs, even if there are challenges in terms of meeting fidelity. There's a need in that context for housing for therapeutic court members when they seek that alternative to prosecution that they can have as a part of their process, an adequate roof over their heads to meet their goals under the mental health court requirements. And then again, in relation to methamphetamine dependence, again, not only while folks are in the jail, but when they're in the community, there is just a need for some kind of evidence-based effective methamphetamine dependence treatment. Those are the 4 areas, and those are the highest priority categories that we identified in our group. And again, it's not to suggest that the other programs that we rated at priority 2 or 3 aren't as important, or others that we didn't rank are as important in the sense of they meet a need. But this is the product of the work that we've done thus far. So questions and comments for any of us who've made our presentations? Perry, I'm going to let you look for raised hands or people who want to speak, and then maybe adjudicate who's going to respond.
You bet. Thank you, Dean. Scott?
Yeah, I've heard this a couple times now, and one thing that keeps popping into my mind is I have no clue of a budget. So if you does anybody know, if we got all of our number ones, what that would cost? It would be just interesting to know if we knew a number, we at least know where to ask for or what to ask for.
Yeah, I'll have Dean respond to that one, Scott.
Thanks.
So you've actually identified the next step in the process, because we've identified, what are the variables we need to know in order to assign a dollar amount to these services, both in terms of expanded capacity or instituting a new program. And they have to do with things like, evidence-based or data-driven estimates of need. How many folks are there who need one or more of these services and aren't getting it? And then in some cases, what's the capacity that's needed in terms of workforce or physical facilities to meet that need? And what does it cost to put those in place, either in terms of staff or construction of a building or whatever it might be? And so that really is the next step in the process, as I understand it, that the group along with the SAC is going to be working on.
Arlene?
I just wanted to thank you so much for this work. This is tremendously good work, and what a great start that you are making on this huge issue. And I understand that you have to cut it into pieces that we can eat. And but at the same time, I would like you to think large and think big, because we know that as long as there are any gaps, people fall through them. And that's why we're doing this work, right? So we know this. So even though we're focusing on bites, let's look at the big picture and not lose track of that, and ask for more, ask for what we really want to have, because this is our big opportunity to fill the gaps, and it isn't going to come a lot of times for us. But mostly I just wanted to thank you for the work that's so good.
Thanks so much, Arlene. Just an amazing opportunity to work with some really knowledgeable folks. I had to pedal pretty fast just to stay up with them. Stephen?
Thank you. I want to thank Scott for his relentless focus on the practicalities of work like this, especially the cost question. But I want to loop back on that, really back to day one of the task force, because the other factor to consider there, and I don't know whether the BGAT will be able to tackle this in the scope of its work, but there's an offsetting question that we ought to be aware of avoided cost, because if we don't do these things, we still incur costs, and we know that the costs we incur are greater. The incarceration costs are greater than treatment costs. So just as an example, Dean emphasized a couple times the need to increase the capacity for on-demand, no waiting mental health assessments. If we don't do that in Intercept 0, then they get involved in being involved with law enforcement or booked at the jail. If we don't do it at that Intercept 1 point, they're spending time in jail. And even if it's a couple of days, we know from the Vera report that a couple of days of incarceration with the fragility of lives of most of the people we're dealing with starts to unravel all sorts of pieces in terms of housing, employment, custody of children, so on and so forth. So there are costs that are being avoided by incurring the costs of responding to some of the needs and gaps that the team's assessment has identified. I don't know what those are either, just like we don't know what the costs of implementation would be, but they ought to be things that we have in the front of our minds.
It's a great point, Stephen, and I know that most of the folks in the task force are aware of the success that Grace has had in terms of in relation to the cost and the reduction of involvement in the criminal legal system, as well as the LEAD program. And so some great examples of some programs that actually cross a number of our intercepts from 0 through obviously Intercept 1 law enforcement, and then also reentry and post-incarceration. So I would agree with you that the cost is probably, in comparison to the cost of the incarceration and the ongoing cascading effect of that individual being incarcerated without availability of services, is significant. Yeah, Dean?
I just want to emphasize the point that Stephen has made about identifying costs. And what I heard you describe, Stephen, was not just those direct costs that the county may incur or other agencies may incur, but what people call externalities, the social costs and the costs to our community in various ways by not having these kinds of things in place. They're, of course, harder to calculate, but much more important. And if we have the capacity, should be built into our analysis.
Well, seeing no other hands raised or questions, certainly appreciate the opportunity to be involved in the group and also obviously the presentation. Oh, and I will back up for just a moment. Heather, please.
Thank you so much, Perry. I love this presentation and I learn something new every time I hear it. So thank you for all of the work that went into that. And I just want to offer for that Intercept 0, there is a lot of great work going on in the community right now too. And so if there's ever a space that makes sense for a presentation on that, I'd love to help bring those people together for that. So because all the science shows that actually, if we really want to make that impact, it starts before the age of 5. So I just want to help make that connection here too. So thank you.
And Perry, if I could just mention one more thing, I do recall Marty in the course of our work asking if we could raise the question about the task force, since it was the originator of this first version of the SIM document, if it could take under consideration looking at the update that this group has done and essentially adopting it as now its most recent version of the SIM that it's using for its work. So just put that out there for the co-chairs, perhaps for your consideration.
Stephen, do you mind if I respond to that? This is Jack.
No, please, Jack.
Hey, Dean, good to see you. Good morning. I think we'll bring that up at steering committee. I don't recall that we've actually ever officially adopted a SIM as the official version. I could be mistaken on that, but we will bring it up at steering committee. I think there's a de facto belief that when the SIMs are presented here, they are what they are, but I don't. Anyway, we'll bring it up to steering committee and we can respond to you on that. I think Barry may be commenting on that now.
Yeah, I think one of the original intents for the task force using it was we included it in our, 2020 or 2019 annual report. I think the system inventory is what we called it at the time. And we just utilized the SIM to do that inventory. So I think that's kind of how the task force sort of adopted it. It adopted it as a piece of that annual report.
And one other thing that'll be helpful, Dean, is there definitely was feedback. While I don't recall it being officially adopted, I definitely recall it being influenced, whether
Yes.
it's being added or discussed, or so there was certainly, in the spirit of a consensus, you might say, some unanimity around the acceptance of it and people accepting that this existed after their input. So we'll bring that up at steering and respond to that.
So my last question is either to Perry or the Collective Begat team or to Barry, I'm not sure. But there were references to feedback now to this presentation and to the actual SIM update that you circulated in our meeting packet. And could somebody speak to how task force members might have further input that would inform your conversations as you continue this work?
This hasn't been something that the team has formally, discussed, but I really found that the survey that was sent out that we obviously still have copies of, along with the updated SIM, may be the most appropriate way to gather that information. And so that's what I would recommend, but I may be speaking out of turn here, that the task force receives, they have a copy of the SIM, but at any rate, an email that is a copy of the SIM along with a survey for input or thoughts. And that way we have that documentation and those other components. So those are my thoughts. Mike may have some thoughts as well.
Thanks, Perry. I was going to chime in briefly. As one of the committee co-chairs, I remember soliciting a lot of input. We took it to providers at that point and tried to get a robust update. We really owe Ann Deacon a favor yet again for the 1,000th time. She did a lot of work on that old SIM. And Jack, my memory is exactly like you have. I think we did a lot of work to it. We updated it, we presented it, but I'm not sure that we finally adopted that. So. But I can tell you that this update to the SIM, and especially once we get the dollar figures added to it, I think is going to be well worth the task force considering adopting, as it's kind of as it's formally adopting it.
Barry, do you have anything you want to say as we wrap up this part of the agenda?
Did you say Barry or Perry?
I actually said Barry.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Excuse me.
Well, I want to thank Perry and his team for all the work they put into this over the last three and a half months. this is just kind of a flavor of the work that's being done for the Justice Project as far as the needs assessment goes, and some of the information being presented to the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. So we're proud of the work that our folks are doing, and we look to continue. We have another meeting coming up in mid-July. That'll be a work session. So you can look forward to kind of the results of that work session sometime after that. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Perry, and thank you, Mike, Jackie, Dean, the whole team. Really an excellent job. So if I recall your summary at the outset, Jack, we go back to you for the annual report.
Yep, thank you. All right, everyone, this is we're looking for a decision to approve the annual report, which is now in your packet. I think most of you that are, well, everyone on the task force has been seeing the various drafts of this for a while now. I'm not aware of any expressed concerns since the last drafts were sent out. So what I would be looking for is a motion to approve the 2022 annual report to the County Council and Executive as written, or pardon me, as published in pages 7 to 31 of our packet. Is anyone willing to make that motion? And then we can discuss anything that needs to be discussed.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya. Do we have a second?
My second.
Thank you, Raylene. So is there discussion, questions, concerns, anything that needs to be said about the 2022 annual report? Okay, hearing none. Jill, are we doing this with hands or voice? I think we can do it with voice because everybody can unmute, and then I'll make sure I ask for abstentions and any opposition. So all in favor of approving the 2022 annual report as published in the packet, please, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Does anyone wish to be noted as an, oh, Darlene, yes.
I so apologize. I couldn't get my hand up quick enough. I just wanted to note on page 23 that the list of behavioral health committee members is not correct.
Okay, and I'm sure, I doubt anyone would have an objection if you could communicate to Jill what that is to get it accurate. Does anyone have an objection to that? Okay, it sounds like a typo or an omitted person. If you can take care of that. Thank you so much, Darlene, for pointing that out. Okay, we were at the ayes. We had a lot of ayes. I'd like to ask if there are any abstentions, if anybody needs to be noted as an abstention. And is anyone opposed? Seeing no opposition and no abstentions, the motion to approve the 2022 annual report to the council and executive is approved unanimously by the task force. Thank you, everyone. A lot of work. And we really need to thank Jill for putting this together. Jill, thank you. It was a lot of work, and you've been a dream for this task force to provide the infrastructure we need. So thank you. As I mentioned at the top of the meeting, many of you have seen the letter from Sheriff Elfo talking about the current situation with the downtown jail. So we're referring to the downtown facility, obviously not the Division Street. And it seemed appropriate, given the impact of that, to set aside some time so the sheriff could make some comments about that to the task force, and then allow some time for questions and answers to him. And we're going to make that space available now. And Sheriff Elfo, I'm turning it over to you. I know you'll be unmuted in a minute. It's just you got to find the arrow.
There we go. Well, thank you for giving me a few minutes at the beginning, at this point in the meeting, to address the letter I sent to the presiding judge of the Superior and District Court with copies to all the municipal judges, police chiefs, and prosecutors in Whatcom County. regarding the current jail situation. And I don't want to sound frustrated or at worst angry, but as elected official, I have an obligation to speak on this compelling matter of public importance, particularly before a body as important as this. I appreciate the information we received today on the work that's being done to better serve those in need and reduce the jail population, hopefully from early on, hopefully from childhood, before they're intercepted by law enforcement or come to their attention even. But however, today we're approaching a breaking point from which we need some relief immediately. I won't be redundant and go over the letter. Everybody can read. But as it says, the current situation is untenable, and we've reached levels in booking restrictions that we've not seen before that defy any notions of public safety and the effective administration of justice. And the current situation is not new, novel, or an aberration. It's a growing problem that has been evolved over decades. And now we're at the point where people being assaulted with impunity, particularly in the downtown Bellingham area, frustrating the police department. We have organized criminal enterprises that are going unfettered. And we are on a booking release for most felony warrants now that are unable to, and we're unable to book most people that commit serious crimes. They're booked and released. Despite the findings of numerous other committees, task force, engineers, the U.S. Department of Justice that have reviewed this situation over the last 26 years, it's not been remedied. And in fact, it's been, by some, not the majority, it's been a situation that's been trivialized in my mind. The chickens are really coming home to roost at this point. The only thing that's been held the system together and kept things functioning in some semblance of workable solutions are the good people that work in the jail system. And now, out of frustration by many, we're losing some of our best. We're currently down 11 correction deputy positions, which represents 16% of our workforce, and have resorted to unsustainable mandated overtime and short call-in notice at levels that are unsustainable. This is causing a number of issues for the deputies personally in their personal lives. It's affecting their families. There's a number of reasons that I've outlined in the letter for this occurring in my mind. One has been the closure of the courts while our people continued to work. It's been a backlog with convicted sex offenders sitting in jail because the Department of Corrections people won't come into jail because they're afraid of catching COVID to interview the people convicted of crimes as a process of completing a pre-sentence investigation. It's the backlog from the court closures. Cases are going unresolved. It's a backlog with getting people into competency hearings or competency restoration, I should say, at Western State Hospital. We have 12 waiting to go down there. It's a 12 to 16 week process to get them there. And we have another 18 down there that are going to be coming back. And as I say in the letter, we just heard a rumor is reported in the media, so I'll call it a rumor. We haven't got any official correspondence that Eastern State Hospital in Medical Lake is going to be closing because they've lost their accreditation. And that's going to have an impact. At the same time, 42% of our jail population now has serious and dangerous forms of mental illness. And again, I thank special thanks to Dean and Jackie for all they're doing to help resolve these issues. And I applaud the effort of all the mental health and substance abuse alternatives that are in the jail. But one example, we've implemented the medically assisted treatment program for opioids. We've gone from like 9 participants to over 100. That all sounds very good. But what we're seeing is, it takes one deputy off shift. This is an all-day process to make sure they don't manipulate the system to abuse the drug that's administered and we're just hurting for personnel. That's the main issue that we're dealing with. I want to applaud the construction of the operation of the Crisis Stabilization Center. That's great for people that need help and go in there. But as of last check, they're not taking involuntary holds. Those are the people that still end up in the jail. So as an interim solution, I'm going to ask council to rent 45 jail beds in Snohomish County as soon as possible. Snohomish County is in the process of reviewing the contract that's been going back and forth, and we want to proceed with this in a timely manner. But it's going to cost literally millions of dollars a year to do this. So I'm hoping council will support this. I think we've pulled most of the rabbits out of the air so far, or out of our hats. And effective today, we further increased the scope of booking restrictions. We're now not bringing people back that are apprehended in other counties on Whatcom County warrants, felony or misdemeanor for most crimes. We're not taking fugitive warrants, out-of-state warrants for people that have been involved in serious criminal activity for most crimes. And the next step is to eliminate booking for any property crime, including auto theft and most forms of burglary. I appreciate the work of Council Member Buchanan in leading the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, which is charged with recommending solutions. But we must remember that even if council were to approve some way funding a replacement of the downtown jail this afternoon, we won't see any relief for the next 4 to 5 years in my mind. Take that long to site it, permit it, and construct it. I wish I had better news, but wanted to provide a very candid situation and report as to the gravity of the matter and at what effect it's having in our community. I think citizens are becoming very frustrated. I'm hearing from them every day, and it's a problem that needs to be resolved. So we put some new limitations in effect as of this morning. The jail population in the downtown jail is 185. But whenever we get a COVID outbreak at the work center or the downtown jail, it precludes us from transferring people between the two facilities. So that causes, we have no way to balance the population in the appropriate manner. So anyhow, I appreciate you listening to me, and as you continue this important work, if you would just keep this, what we're dealing with, in the back of your mind, and try to keep it as a priority, it would be most appreciated by me and all the good people that work in the jail. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. Question from Maya.
Thank you. Thanks for your letter, Chief. You articulate a lot of problems we see every day. I just wanted to make a remark about the use of the Snohomish County Jail, because we occasionally have clients who are housed there who maybe have cases in multiple jurisdictions, and there is no meaningful way for council to have confidential communications with clients who are housed in the Snohomish County Jail. There's no video or phone options that we can use. And that means that our attorneys, if we have clients, who are housed pre-trial in Snohomish County, that's an extraordinary amount of travel and time. It's just not really realistic. So I just put that out there as an additional issue that has to be taken into consideration when housing folks out of custody.
Yeah, we're doing this as a very last resort. And we've working with Snohomish County and with Perry at the IT department to find out what solutions may be worked out. We will be going there every day to bring people back and forth. And we know some of the solutions other counties have found that house people out of county is to hire a deputy public defender that lives in that region to deal with their caseload. I know I've heard from Stark how hard it is to find attorneys now, just almost as hard as it is finding people to work in the jail.
Yeah, there are no attorneys that could accept those cases working in Snohomish County. Dave Reynolds has been trying to find conflict counsel to no avail for cases that our office can't accept due to ethical conflicts. So I don't think that that is in no way a reasonable approach to the problem. I'm glad to hear that IT is getting involved, and maybe if they can set up some means for confidential communication, that's a different story. But this is the first I'm hearing of that. I'd be interested to help on that front if I can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for the sheriff? Then I will just thank you. Oh, we have Jeffrey.
Sorry about that. Do we have any idea of how many people are in the eastern state, and if that does close, what that's going to look like?
All we know is what we've heard in the media. I don't know the precise numbers. I don't even know the state's plan. But we would have to assume that if Eastern State closes, some of those people are going to be coming to Western State for the same services.
And the last time we checked with Western State, they were at capacity. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Thank you, Raylene. Any other questions for the sheriff? So I just want to say thank you, Bill, for coming in and doing this extemporaneously. It's obviously an extremely important topic that informs all the work we do. Thank you for your time.
And it's, rapidly evolving as well. And I don't know if it's the job market or the reputation of the infrastructure in our jail. We used to get 60 people applying for one vacant position. Right now, we have absolutely zero. And our people that work up there become attractive candidates to law enforcement agencies around the state. They're well trained. We do extensive backgrounds. And so they find positions with more attractive salaries, more attractive benefits, and opportunity to do other things. So there's a lot of factors affecting the exodus that we're seeing.
So on behalf of the task force, I'll just say thank you for articulating that, advocating for that, because obviously the council and decision makers need that information as we try to improve things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Stephen, I'm going to turn this over to you for budget and communications with Barry.
Thank you, Jack. Sheriff Helpful, let me extend my own appreciation for the sense of responsibility that feels an obligation to convey bad news as well as good news. And I think the forcefulness of your report warrants some internal discussion within the task force, at least in the steering committee to begin with, for ways in which we can support your efforts to address the current circumstances. So I suspect there'll be further conversations in this regard.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Stephen.
Next agenda item is having to do with the upcoming 2023-2024 biennial budget, the process for which is beginning within the county council. And I think my responsibility here is basically turning it over to Councilmember Buchanan to begin a discussion of this topic. Barry?
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks again, Sheriff Elfo, for being here and really laying the facts out for us. We really appreciate it. Hard as it is to hear, it's important for us to hear it. As far as the budget is concerned, there's kind of two tracks that we're looking at. One is the normal budgetary track, in which we, various departments put in requests through the executive's office for either positions or programs that they want to do in the next biennium. So that process is underway. And what that means for the task force, excuse me, is we need to have our subcommittees in the coming weeks and months soon, to get some sort of an idea of things that budgetary requests that you might have through your committees, and get that to the steering committee. We'd like to get that probably by the end of July at the latest. So if we could kind of really put that on the front burner, that would be appreciated. The other side of that was the ARPA side. The council back in September of 2021 the task force sent a letter in September of 2021 to the council and to the executive's office, recommending kind of some categories for ARPA funds that we thought were appropriate for the work that we're doing. And those 4 things were, number 1, behavioral health workforce. Another workforce issue seems like it's everywhere, where there's just a shortage of folks being applying for jobs, and there's so many people just quitting jobs. It's kind of mystifying. But that's one. The other 3 are pretrial and reentry support, 24/7 mental health and urgent care. And then the last one is supported and transitional housing. And you heard that during the presentation by Perry's group that a lot of this stuff is definitely in the deep thinking mode right now, as far as the health department's concerned, and the stakeholder advisory committee is considering. So these things are really being scrutinized and looked at carefully. One of the things I had hoped to provide today was a kind of an update on where that ARPA discussion was. I was unable to get a hold of the executive's office at the end of the week. They were up in the I think it was the Women in the Woods tour, so that nobody had any services, cell phone service, so unable to connect. I would bring that back next time to get a status on kind of where that thinking is on the ARPA funds. So that's really all I had to talk about today about the biennial budget and the ARPA piece. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Barry, let me expand on that just for a bit, because one of the questions in the ARPA part of your presentation is our understanding, and I think Mike Parker was the articulator of this, so Mike, correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, was that letter was drafted in a consciously, intentionally general way, not to try to develop cost estimates, but to leave that with county staff who had more expertise and more hands-on experience with that. In response to the letter, I believe Deputy Executive Schroeder responded asking the task force to develop some cost estimates for both the executive's office and the council to consider in the budget process. So the ball's been at least rolled back into our court. And I think the question of, are we in a position to provide budgetary recommendations in any sort of detail or not is one of the open questions for the task force to take a look at. And so, Mike, if you have more comments, Heather, I know you were the drafter of the letter, so there are some backroom conversations about dollar figures or no from the task force end of this conversation, and just welcome any context either of you might lay for how we respond to the council's request.
Well, Stephen, if I might, I didn't see anybody calling me, but I'll go ahead and just unmute.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I was trying to call on you, Mike.
Oh, no, that is no problem at all. I don't mind coming off. I thought you characterized it really well. And the one thing that I would add is in the behavioral health subcommittee where we kind of generated this letter, and Heather, I'd love for you to come off mute and explain further as well. We believed it was within our lane to make suggestions, and we really appreciated that opportunity, but we also didn't want to get into a situation where we were mentioning specific programs. And that seemed to be, at least in our minds of the subcommittee, kind of out of our scope. We didn't want to be seen as endorsing either one agency over another and or choosing programs and or interventions. We're happy to consult and provide feedback, however, if that's desired, but we really think that's a better place for the Perrys and Jackies and folks in health department to have that expertise and know the proper channels, by the way, to get those things funded. Then I'll stop there. And then Heather, if you have anything to add about the letter creation and kind of our thinking regarding that.
Well, just to comment on what Mike just said, he's absolutely right. And that's been the approach all along from the administration, was to come up with buckets instead of, programs. So that, we kind of followed in line with the same way that the council and the executive's office has been going back and forth on ARPA, was to develop these buckets and then further refine that later. So Heather, did you want to add to what Mike had to say?
I don't mind if Arlene goes first and then I can go next.
Arlene, take it away.
Yes, yes. I think it's reasonable for the executive's office to be wondering about the costs of these programs. And we do need to help them get that information. And the only way I've thought about doing that is by talking to the people who are doing those kinds of programs in other cities. What I saw in the closest program, let's say for the 24/7 urgent care, was in Everett. And when I explored their program, what I saw was that it's not 24/7 in Everett. It's weekends off and so forth. So obviously they ran into, I'm thinking, the budgetary issue. I'm assuming that, but I think it's highly likely because of the cost of staffing. We know that having good staff and paying them 24/7 is expensive. We could ask the police about this if we wanted to know more. So I think it's fair to try and get that information, but we have to do a little research for that.
Stephen, forgive me. Will you repeat is the question what happens next after this letter, or what happened next? Why we don't have budget numbers?
I think the question is sort of a compound one. It's what was the intention behind the original request? Did the group formulating that request in part think that we did or did not within the task force have the capacity to put numbers on those areas? And what reaction might you and the other drafters of that letter have to Deputy Executive Schroeder's request for some more specificity in dollar terms?
So I'll just be really frank too. We were really grateful for the opportunity, right? That we were even asked in the first place as a task force, the Behavioral Health Committee. Clearly it's aligned with what we're seeing now with that needs assessment and the gaps assessment. And when the request came back for more specifics, I think my perspective is that where the ARPA conversation was holistically was really, it was all sort of up in the air. And I think we were feeling this sense of, we don't want to do a lot of work for specifics if the ARPA priorities are going to fall primarily in other areas. And so if there is actually attention and need at this point, I think combining task force representatives with the BGAT team, like what Dean was saying, if that's their next step anyway, to do some fiscal analysis, I think there could be capacity for some of us here as citizens or volunteers or within our scope of career or position. So I think that would be a great next step, and it just didn't happen because I think there was so much influx around those ARPA dollars with where will council and where will the executive's office really land with priorities.
And I would totally agree with what Heather said about the BGAT team is probably the logical spot to develop that kind of granular information on programming. So we just have to kind of schedule when those next steps are gonna, take place.
So I'll just note, and Perry, if you disagree, let me know, but the BGAT team is really sort of in the middle of carrying out its charge for the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. So I think part of that overlaps with this and part of it doesn't. So Perry, to the extent you can coordinate with maybe Heather and our behavioral health co-chairs, Mike Parker and Dan Hamill, great. If you need to stage that out with your other work that you've already taken on, I think that's pretty reasonable. The other thing I'll say is there's part of this that we might be able to put some numbers to, but there's part of it that is more related to what Barry was talking about in terms of funding buckets. And I'll just note that our letter recommending supportive housing support, I mean, that's something that the best we're going to be able to do, even with the volume of ARPA dollars we have, is to provide one small portion of funding for that. And I think until we talk to housing developers, the Housing Authority, and the other nonprofit providers, that's always an arduous process, piecing together dribs and drabs of funding from multiple sources. That's not a quick process. It's not an easy process. So I don't know that we could do better in the ARPA designation process at the council level than to ask for a bucket of money. And maybe we could quantify that. I don't know, but that would require some work. And I think that would be outside the BGAT process, perhaps. So I see, I talked long enough to develop a whole waiting line of comments. I'll start with you, Scott.
Yeah. First of all, based on what the sheriff just talked about, and I've heard there's trying to segregate a good chunk of the ARPA money, probably for a jail down payment. And I, as one member of this task force, would encourage the money to go that way at this point, because that is a dire need. And a second concern I have, I think most of the things that we are talking about are expenses that are continuing and ongoing in a budgetary sense. And I hate to use one-time money, ARPA money, to fund something that needs continual funding. We need to find if we're going to fund things continually, we need a continued source, and don't use one-time money for it and then 5 years from now or 2 years from now go, oh, you know, our funding is gone. We need to find a source of money that takes us for the duration, and not one-time money. It's very easy to spend one-time money on reoccurring expenses and then run into trouble later. So that's my caution for us as we look at budgeting.
Great point, Scott. Thank you very much. Raylene, you're next.
Thank you. I've heard an overwhelming need for staffing, corrections, mental health. It seems to be an ongoing theme throughout a lot of the committees and meetings. And I don't know how we can fix that other than supplying some incentives to work in different fields, whether it's more education that's being paid for, or if it's incentives to hire more corrections deputies, to hire more mental health staff. Can we do remote evaluations from other states where the cost of living is lower, but still require the same standards that the state has set? I mean, there's a lot of different questions out there. How can we actually staff it? We can build all these wonderful programs, but if we can't staff it, there's no point.
Thank you, Raylene. And so I think where I go in my mind with both Scott's and Raylene's comments is the possibility that the drafters, the Behavioral Health Committee, and the BGAT team might want to take a look at those recommendations and see if they need some tweaking in light of recent deteriorating conditions, maybe some recalibration of priorities, and just note that for further conversation. Dean, please.
Well, this is my own view, not really coming from the whole team of the BGAT that did this work, but in reference to permanent supported housing, you know, we talked about there's a need for more of it, more units. But I'm concerned that the credibility of that model is at risk because we haven't provided sufficient staffing support and attention to the fidelity of permanent supported housing. And I think there's been publicity about 22 North that both the Opportunity Council and Northwest Regional and Northwest Youth Services rather collaborate in operating or supporting. there's a need to make sure we've adequately staffed and adequately defined the way in which the fidelity of permanent supported housing and housing first gets implemented in this community, or we're at risk of that model losing credibility within the community. And so I would just emphasize that as a fairly high, it's sort of analogous to what the sheriff's been talking about in terms of the jail. That work of supporting those folks who've lived on the street for a long time, it's not easy work, and it really requires sufficient staffing and attention to fidelity.
That's very helpful insight, Dean, and very strong recommendation. Thank you. Heather and then Mike.
I'm listening to every comment and just really thinking about how deep the need is in our community and the reality of that. I know you all live in that too. And what I want to say right now is that regardless of ARPA funding, all of those priorities that were put forth are critical and important to moving forward as a community. And I also want to add that the fiscal analysis for each of those categories is complicated. The funding streams are incredibly complex. Understanding really what is the need on the ground. Are we talking 25 people? Are we talking 2,000 people? As you've all noted, it's complex to figure out the workforce piece, if you're going to build new housing, all of those are just complicated. And I do think that it requires specialists to help with that fiscal mapping because it's not just about where is the ongoing revenue going to come from, or where is the one-time funds that we can use. Sometimes there's also advocacy within existing funding streams that we can do as a community. So for example, saying Medicaid, we need you to pay for these 5 extra services. So it is complicated. I'm all in helping figure all of that out. So however that makes sense moving forward, I'm supportive of that.
Thank you, Heather. Appreciate that. Mike, your turn. And then I think we'll need to sort of wrap this up for the moment and get a temperature check from Barry on where we stand.
Okay, I'll try to make this brief. This goes along the lines a little bit of what Dean was talking about. And sorry about that. One of the things that the Behavioral Health Gap Analysis Group has put up to a high priority is a PAC team. And just to let folks know, if you're going to implement permanent supportive housing with high fidelity, it normally has more clinical focus. So that has been identified as a really important need in our community to have additional PAC teams, and that would support not only folks that are housed in existing permanent supportive housing programs, but could also work alongside Grace and LEAD.
Thank you, Mike. Barry, this started out as your presentation. Sorry if it got out of hand, but where do you think we stand with following up on this?
Well, I think going back to the kind of the first thing I talked about, which is just our normal budgetary needs for the task force itself. Want to get the committees, the subcommittees, I should say, working on that and get that information back to the steering committee as soon as possible. That's one piece. The other piece is this complex piece of not just ARPA, but the evaluation of these priorities and how we look at identifying what those needs specifically are is at the top of my mind right now for getting some answers to. So I think we'll work with through the executive's office and through the BEGAT folks to see how we can further define the actual kind of budgetary requirements that we really need to meet these priorities. So I think that's next. I think also getting kind of a status of where we are in general on ARPA is important too, just to find out where we are, what have we committed to so far, and how much is left, those kind of basic questions. So that's what I think is the next step, Stephen.
Great. So I'll just note that there are good things and bad things about the council's budget planning process. Good thing is gives us opportunities to have input. Bad thing is that it has its own relentless time frame to it. So there are going to be conversations obviously going on to move this forward, but I'll just say for all the other task force members, please keep these cost questions, the practicalities that Scott keeps bringing us back to. Please keep these in the front of your mind, because the conversations are going to result in recommendations, and they're going to need thoughtful action on the part of all of us. So we'll hear more about these. And thanks everybody for your contributions to this conversation. The next item on the agenda has to do with task force communications efforts. And Barry, you're on for this as well.
Yeah, I seem to be up for everything today. Anyway, this should be short. Communications is, as you know, we put in for a placeholder going into the supplemental budget. We put in for $50,000 for the task force for communications. So we have now gone through the whole RFP process. We have a contract developed to look at that next week. So there's really not much more to say about that. If Jill would like to add anything to that, I think that would be great.
Thank you, Barry. Yes, you're correct. The contract is going before the County Council's Finance Committee next week. It was scheduled last week and got pulled due to an outstanding question, but that's all resolved. And hopefully next week we'll have a communications contractor almost on board and contract signed soon. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Jill, could I just ask you to also summarize the two phases of the contract we're expecting, the two phases of work that we're calling on the consultant to do, just as background for task force members, refreshing their memories?
Sure, and we've really eliminated the phasing language in the contract since it was originally constructed. Essentially, we're asking the contractors to work with the task force and the steering committee to help identify a set of key messages that the task force wants to send out into the community and to its various stakeholders and partners and agencies in the community, and then develop a communications campaign around those key messages. And then we're also asking them to put together a framework for future key messaging campaigns that task force members, stakeholders, and staff can implement themselves for any future messaging that you'd like to do.
Great, thank you. Barry, anything else?
No, I think that's it. We'll, like I said, put that before the council next week in the finance committee, and hopefully we'll get that contract going.
Stephen, you're muted. Oh, there you are.
Thank you, Barry. Sorry to load up the agenda topics on your shoulders today.
That's okay.
Did a great job. Jack, I'll turn it back to you for committee updates and bringing us home. I hope I've left you enough time.
No, it's perfect. But I got to turn it back over to Barry. Barry, I can do the other committees out of order, but steering, it just seemed kind of funny. But yeah, steering committee is first on the agenda, and Barry, you are the chair of that committee. So if you'd like to give it up.
Okay. Okay, so I don't have my notes with me. They're in the office, but I can put together a brief report. We talked about GARE again, which is the Government Accountability for Racial Equity. The county has joined that, and the task force has joined that. And the question has been, how do non-county employees access any resources that GARE offers? So, and that kind of resulted from an inquiry that we have made about being able to get some resources available to task force members and some of the subcommittee members. And one of the requirements is that you had to have a Whatcom County email address in order to access those resources. Well, Jackie Lassiter from our office, the council office, kind of did a deep dive into some of those available resources that GARE has, and really found that there's a lot of them that are just publicly available. There's not a big requirement to have membership to access some of those resources. So she sent links around to some various documents and things that are available through GARE. I guess we can post that to a wider audience, I believe, to the whole task force, so you can see what's available. And we continue to ask that question because there are some things that are membership only that we are trying to look at how we can expand access to that. So that was kind of what we talked about on GARE. We talked about a little bit about the Vera report, and I think that's best summarized in Jack's little blurb that he wrote up for the annual report that you have in your packet, where he did a kind of a summary of kind of not exactly where we are. Jack can explain that better than I can, but we, he really lays out kind of some of the efforts that have taken place regarding some of the things on the Vera report that was issued back in 2016, 17. When was that, Jack?
Well, the report was 17.
17, yeah. So I don't know if you had anything to add to that, but that's really basically what we talked about in terms of Vera. Other things that we talked about, actually, that was it. We talked about the annual report, and that's something that we approved today. So that's all I have, and I don't think I'm up for anything else today. Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Barry. Did you want to mention anything, because I don't see it elsewhere on the agenda, and it sort of falls under steering, about the relationship with SAC and the task? Is there anything we want to say about SAC to the task force that would come under the steering committee umbrella? I mean, just that we had a meeting last week. A lot of you were on that, but I don't know, as I think about the jail and what's going on, it just seemed maybe, I don't know, am I out of line even suggesting it? I'm not sure.
Well, no, one of the things that we decided early on in this project was to involve the task force as a part of an advisory body to the SAC and to the process, because of all the expertise that we've developed over the years in the task force. So then we thought, well, the steering committee is the steering committee for the task force, so it would be a good body to discuss some of the things that come up regarding the SAC process. So we've been utilizing and since Jack and I and Stephen are the planning team for the SAC process, it seemed natural that the steering committee could be a big part of that, kind of guiding that process. So we've been utilizing the co-committee chairs for presentations to the SAC that have took place in March, and there's another one coming up. There's a big one coming up I think it's this week, I believe. No, it's in July. That's right. It's early July, like July 7th. I think it's the behavioral health, another session with the SAC. So we've really gotten a lot of mileage out of involving the task force in the process, because like I said, kind of in my opening on this question, was that, all the expertise and the familiarity that we've gained through the years in this task force really, really makes it a great body to provide guidance to this process. So that's kind of what I would have to say about that.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks for just interjecting that. I just think it's important to keep that SAC bridge. There's a lot of work going on right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on.
All right. Mike, did you want, and I apologize, and I know I'm just kind of calling on people, and Caleb, if you want to say anything in a few minutes about index, but Mike, would you like to say anything about the Behavioral Health Committee or any kind of report other than what's
Yeah,
in?
sure. Very, very briefly, and I do apologize for my my inspired young one here. She's excited today. So Behavioral Health Committee met. One of the things we talked about was a future joint meeting with Legal and Justice. So we discussed items for that. We had a presentation from the city of Bellingham talking about downtown safety and some of their work with RSU and ambassador programs, and how do those things work with existing programs like homeless outreach team and behavioral health providers, which was really valuable. We didn't have a presentation from Northwest Youth Services on youth mental health. We do look forward to that at a future meeting. And one of the other big discussions that we had is we talked about a little bit, as Heather mentioned, our feedback on the ARPA letter and some of those services. But one new program that's coming on will be a clubhouse offered by NAMI. And I believe this task force is going to get a presentation on the clubhouse model and what they do. This addresses one of the biggest priorities of the behavioral health subcommittee is a 24/7 for everybody that doesn't go to the crisis stabilization center, right? We need an open facility for that. So the clubhouse model, while it follows a evidence-based practice, won't be exactly that. It fills a much needed niche. So we discussed that. And that is the lion's share of what the behavioral health committee was. We really enjoyed, by the way, Dan and I both, the sessions with SAC members, and some of the questions they're asking are really good, really pointed. And I just want to tell everybody, I know we keep bringing up GARE, we're going to keep bringing that up. And I think we have to further that. So some subjects, maybe we bring up a lot, but that's because they're really important. And so appreciate the task force keeping on this, not letting our foot off the pedal. It's really important that we do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And I appreciate your passion about Gary. You've been certainly a driving force in that. Thank you. All right. I know it's Caleb. Is it Sergeant? I don't know your official. Deputy Erickson? I'm not sure.
Caleb's fine. I'm a lieutenant.
Lieutenant. Well, I was in the military, so if I called you Sergeant, I'd be doing push-ups. So sorry.
It's all good. Yep. Lieutenant Erickson, Whatcom County Sheriff's Office Corrections Bureau. Index met on the 2nd of June. We had a relatively short agenda. We discussed the proposal that Stephen really instigated in terms of getting information that's already readily available, reports and other information that's disseminated amongst partners in the criminal justice system out to number one, the task force website. And then we also talked about that happening in parallel to the community facing websites for the county. And so there was more call to get some of that information gathered offline rather than going around in the meeting. So there's going to be some lifting after that meeting where we're going to talk about what reports exist and how to get those disseminated. And essentially it's looping in Jill to all of those or on all of those communications, and she will make them available to the task force. We also talked about the annual report. So the report narrative is relatively short and, in terms of what the index committee had to contribute. So there weren't any particular issues with that. But again, we reviewed that and said we would probably be better served to approve it. I can't remember my timeline at this moment, but we had a timeline set forth to make that approval. That was pretty much it.
Thank you, Lieutenant Erickson. I should have asked too, were there any questions for Lieutenant Erickson or for Mike on behavioral health or for index? All right, Stephen, I'll turn it back over to you for other business and public comment.
Thank you, Jack. We didn't have a report from Legal and Justice Systems. Raylene, I don't know if you have anything to say other than maybe announcing the joint meeting tomorrow.
I think everything's pretty much in the agenda on the last meeting on May 10th. We do have the joint meeting tomorrow. That should be interesting, enlightening. I encourage anybody to show up and listen in and add to things. And Deborah Garrett did talk about the pretrial processes group. I think we'll be looking into that a little bit further. on data and how many people have been released and the impacts of COVID on how that's kind of stumped the pretrial group, and hopefully moving forward, we'll be able to get some information. Stephen, you mentioned that Dr. Demani Johnson and Adam Pryor will be helping them on data evaluation on racial equity. And we talked about the GARE program implementation, how we can use it, how it's being used. And I think that's also something that we'll continue to do. Don't really have much else on legal and justice, but thank you, Stephen.
Any questions for Raylene on legal and justice systems? Okay. Well, Jill, it's public comment time. I see there's at least one attendee, and so I'd offer an opportunity for public comment.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. We have one attendee at the virtually today. If you'd like to speak to the task force members, please virtually raise your hand now. And then it doesn't appear that we have any attendees in our conference room. Thank you. No hands are raised. And if I could get Barry, Stephen, and Jack to stay after for a moment, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Jill. I'm amazed. We had multiple really enriching conversations over some pretty thorny topics. And at the same time, we've finished ahead of schedule, sort of an unheard of combination, especially on the latter end of that pairing. So thank you all for your contributions to the meeting today and for being here to take part in the conversations. And with that, we'll adjourn the task force meeting for the month of June. Thank you all.